I'm going to show a method for creating color palettes procedurally using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. A palette is a combination of colors that work well together. Usually it's 3 to 5 different colors, and they can be loaded into a gradient map to produce different blending effects. Usually I'd go out to the internet, and there are a number of websites where you can find some pre-generated color palettes to choose from, but another way to do that is to create a procedurally generated palette. Inigo Quiles describes using procedural methods to generate color palettes in an article published in 1999 online on his website. Quiles is an important figure in the shader community. He is one of the founders of ShaderToy, which is one of the most popular environments for creating shader programs. Quiles has published a number of videos online demonstrating his impressive work in computer graphics and computer animation. I'll put some links to his work in the description for this video. In this video, I'm going to look closer at one of his ideas, which is that you can create color palettes procedurally rather than putting in the colors manually. The basic method is to take a sinusoidal function for each color channel and manipulate the frequency, phase, amplitude, and then add a basic offset to the amplitude. I created this example procedural texture to demonstrate the method. In the top portion of the screen, I have the color palette that's being generated. Down in the bottom part of the screen, I have a representation of the different colors that are being used and how they're being manipulated to generate this palette. This shows the red channel. As I go above this center line here, it starts to become visible and goes up to some maximum value. I can change the offset of this to push more of it above the maximum value until it's fully red. I can change the contrast, which will decrease the amount of variation of the red channel. But then if I combine that with boosting it, I can get it to have a variation like this. And then I can adjust the frequency of the red channel, which causes it to look like that. So here's the lower frequency and then a higher frequency. And I can bring the frequency all the way down to 0. And since it's based on a cosine function, cosine of 0 is 1. The last adjustment is the phase shift, so I can adjust the phase of the color channel. To get started, I'm going to set the offset for the red, green, and blue channels to about 0.5. I'll also set the contrast for the red, green, and blue to about 0.5. And then I'm going to change the phase of the green channel to approximately 1/3 and the blue channel to approximately 2/3. So that gives me a full spectrum palette. Now let's try some other variations. I can bring these down and get sort of a pattern like that. And Quiles suggests just manipulating these controls until you find something that you find is pretty interesting. Just keep moving them around until you find something that you sort of like. Here are some presets similar to the ones Quiles suggested in his article. I'm going to use a procedural palette to generate a gradient that I can use as a background for an image or something like that. I want to be able to rotate it, so I want to make sure that I have created a rotatable coordinate system, and I'm going to use relative x and y coordinates. Next, I'm going to create 4 different RGB vectors, one for each of the controls I need to manipulate the sinusoidal waveform. I'll start with a new document. I'm going to leave it at 1024 by 768 RGB mode and create that. I'll fill that with black. I'm going to add a live procedural texture filter. I'll start by adding a single equation and assigning it to all 3 channels, and I'll add a single real number input and bring that to 1. I'll label this scale. I need to have rotatable coordinates, so I'll start with that. I'll add a variable v equals vec2 of rx, so a relative x, that enables me to move the image around, times, and now I'm going to apply the rotation matrix to this, cosine of theta, which is going to be my angle. I'll have to add that later. And then ry, relative y coordinate, times sine of theta, th for theta, and then rx times the sine of theta, this is going to be my second component of the vector, plus ry times cosine of theta. So the first time it's cosine minus sine, the second time it's sine plus cosine. Close that with the parentheses, multiply by a, and I want the spectrum to sort of spread out across the image here, and so I'm going to divide by w this time. I need to put in an angle input and label it th, and I'll label that angle. So now I should be able to rotate my coordinates around by holding the shift button down on my keyboard and moving this. I can go to any angle. I'll just leave it at 0 for now. Next, I need to add my 4 vectors that will be the controls for the waveform. In the formula Quiles shows, he labels them A, B, C, and D. Since they're manipulating the color, I'm going to call them AC, BC, CC, and DC. So I'll start with variable AC. It's equal to a vec3, and I'll label that A1, comma A2, comma A3 for my 3 different colors. I'm going to copy this with a Control C and paste it right here with a Control V, and I'm going to change this to BC, and then I'll change each of these to a B. I'll copy this one and paste it here, and I'm going to change this to a C, CC, C1, C2, and C3. Paste this one here. This one will be DC, D1, D2, and D3. To get started with this function, I'm going to use AC, which is the offset. I'll add BC, and I'm going to multiply that by my cosine oscillator, which is cosine. I have to put a 360 in here, and then multiply that by CC, which is the frequency control, and then I'll just put in V dot X. And I need to add a phase offset, which will be DC, and then close that off with parentheses. Now I'm going to add all of my inputs. There will be 3 of them for each of the 4 different parameters that I want to control. I'll start with a -1 to 1 range input for the offset. We'll just add 3 of those. And then I want to use a 0 to 1 slider for the contrast, so I'll add 3 of those. I want to have 0 to 1 sliders for the frequency also, so 3 of those. And then finally the phase offset, I'll make that a -1 slider. and 3 of those. Now I'm going to put in my labels. This will be A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, C1, C2, C3, and D1, D2, and D3. Next I'll add some labels to these. This is offset R. This one is offset G. This one is offset B. This one is contrast R, contrast G, and contrast B. It's important to label them in this example because when you have this many controls, it's really easy to get lost in what you're manipulating here. Frequency R, frequency G, frequency B, and then finally phase R, phase G, and phase B. I'm going to add one more parameter that I'll use when I start using this with gradients. I'm going to just add a 0 to 1 slider, B, and I'm going to call that stretch. I'll use that to stretch out the pattern after I add a different pattern to this. So I've got my scale set to 2, and I can see that I have this repeating pattern. Double click in the middle there, and let's try this out. So I can offset give it less of the red channel or more, and do that with the other channels. I can adjust the contrast of the red, green, and blue channels, and the frequency of the channels. And then I can change the phases of them, move them around. Now I want to put in a more interesting shape than just stripes, and so I'm going to change this to an oscsc oscillator, oscsc, the S-curve oscillator, and I can put V in there. And so that gives me this repeating pattern like that, but I'd like to be able to stretch this out a little bit. So I'm going to change that V dot. I'm going to change V to V dot X, comma V dot Y. So now I can control them independently, and I'm going to multiply my V dot Y times B. Okay. Now when I go to my stretch parameter, I can stretch this out in the Y direction until, if I bring it all the way down to 0, I'm back to just V dot X. But I can have it part way to get patterns like that. And then I can change the offset. And I can just get a little bit more interesting of a gradient pattern using something like that. All right, for now I'm going to leave this at 0, leave this over at 0, and I'm going to bring this down to 2. And for some of the starting ones, I'll set these up to 0.5. So a good starting condition is to have the offset set up to 0.5 for all 3 of them, and then set the contrast 0.5. You can set the frequency for all channels to 1, and then for the original full color spectrum, set this to about 1/3 and this to about 2/3. And there's that one. And then from that point on, you can just manipulate it until you get a pattern that you like. I usually like something that has a little bit lower contrast. And a little bit lower frequency. But you can pretty much just go through here and change these around and come up with a wide variety of different patterns of these palettes. And then if you get something you like, you can shape it a little bit with this, move it around, do some rotation on it. Get something like that. So that's a way that you can use to generate a color palette procedurally. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.